I don't really know how to begin this, but maybe the best way is just to say it straight. I was taken when I was 6 years old. And for years I didn't even know I was missing. The memory of that day is burned into my mind like it just happened yesterday. I can still see the sunlight hitting the road outside my house, the way the cracks in the pavement formed these weird shapes I used to trace with my shoes. I remember my mom's voice calling me inside, her tone carrying that mix of tiredness and love that only a parent has. Everything about that day was normal, so painfully normal, right up until it wasn't. It was late afternoon and I was playing with this cheap plastic toy car that had one wheel broken so it never rolled straight. I'd keep trying to push it down the sidewalk and it would wobble and flip over. To anyone else it was junk. But to me it was everything. That's the last clear memory I have before everything shifted. I didn't hear footsteps. I didn't hear a car pull up. What I do remember is a hand, large, rough, pressing something over my mouth before I even had time to scream. The smell was sharp, chemical, like rubbing alcohol mixed with something sweeter. My vision blurred and the world around me twisted. I remember fighting, kicking, clawing, but my body gave up before my mind did. The last thing I saw before blacking out was the color of the sky, this pale orange glow of sunset, and the thought that I'd wake up in my bed later. But when I woke up I wasn't home. The first thing I noticed was the smell. A damp, rotten odor, like wet wood mixed with old clothes that hadn't been washed. The air was heavy, like there was no fresh wind at all. My eyes adjusted to the dark, and I realized I was lying on a thin mattress pushed against a wall. The walls weren't painted, they were bare concrete. There was a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, but it wasn't even on. Just a tiny bit of light slipped in through a gap in the door. I tried to call for my mom, my dad, or anyone. But my voice cracked, my throat was so dry it hurt to speak. No one came. That's when the fear hit me for real. At 6 years old, I didn't fully understand the word kidnapped, but my body already knew something was very, very wrong. The worst part wasn't even the fear. It was the silence. No sound of traffic, no neighbors, no TV from the next room. Just this awful silence that made every second stretch out like an hour. And then I heard the footsteps. Those footsteps. I'll never forget them. They weren't fast or heavy. They were slow, steady, deliberate, like whoever it was wanted me to hear them. Each step echoed against the walls, louder than it should have been, like the whole place was hollow. My stomach dropped with every sound until the door finally creaked open. The first thing I saw wasn't a face, it was the light from the hallway spilling in. For a second it was so bright compared to the dark room that I had to squint. And then he stepped inside. He was taller than anyone I'd ever seen up close, or maybe he just seemed that way because of how small I was. He wore a dark jacket that looked too big on him, sleeves hanging loose, and a pair of gloves that didn't match. One was leather, the other was some kind of cloth. His face, I can't describe it in detail because at that age I couldn't lock in features the way I can now. What I do remember is the feeling it gave me. Cold. Empty. Like when you look at someone and realize they don't see you as a person. To him I wasn't a kid. I was an object. He didn't say a word at first. Just stared at me while I sat frozen on that mattress. My chest was so tight I couldn't even cry. When he finally did speak, his voice was calm, almost too calm. He told me not to scream, that no one would hear me anyway. He said I had to do what he said if I wanted to stay alive. Alive. That word made my whole body shake. At 6 years old, death was a concept I only understood in pieces. I'd seen it in cartoons, maybe heard about it when a neighbor's dog passed away, but hearing it from him, hearing the threat behind it, made me realize this wasn't some nightmare I could wake up from. He set down a plate of food in front of me. Cold beans, some bread that was hard at the edges. He told me to eat. I didn't want to, but my stomach hurt so much I couldn't resist. Every bite felt like swallowing fear itself. He just stood there watching, arms crossed, waiting until I finished every last piece. After that, he left. The door shut again and I was alone with the silence. That became the routine. He'd come in, bring food, sometimes water, always watching me eat, and then he'd leave. Never a word more than necessary. Never a name. Days blurred together. I had no way of knowing if it was morning or night. The bulb above me stayed dark. My sense of time collapsed. Sometimes it felt like hours had passed, sometimes like weeks. I tried to sleep, but the mattress was so thin the springs dug into my back. And in the dark, my mind would play tricks on me. I'd hear whispers that weren't there, see shadows move even when the door was closed. But the worst part, the part that really broke me, was how quickly the memories of home began to fade. My mom's voice, my dad's laugh, the way the sun felt on my skin when I was outside playing, it all started slipping away like sand through my fingers. And deep down, even though I didn't want to admit it, I started to believe that maybe I'd never see them again. And then one night the routine changed. That night something was different. I could feel it before it even happened, like the air in the room had changed. The silence was heavier, the kind that presses against your chest until you can barely breathe. I remember sitting on the mattress, hugging my knees, when I heard it, 2 sets of footsteps this time. I froze. My mind spun with questions. Who else was here? Was it another kid like me? Was it someone coming to save me? Or was it worse, someone who was going to hurt me even more? The door opened slowly, just like always, but this time he wasn't alone. Another man stepped inside. He was shorter, built heavier, and he didn't bother hiding his face. He looked around the room with this disgusted expression, like even being in the same space as me annoyed him. The taller man, the one I'd come to know as my captor, whispered something to him that I couldn't catch. They both stared at me, and in that moment I felt like an animal on display. The second man laughed in a low, ugly sound that made my stomach twist. He asked something like, "Is this the kid?" And the tall man just nodded. I was shaking so hard that I couldn't even speak, couldn't even ask what they wanted from me. Then the second man crouched down so his face was right in front of mine. He smelled like cigarettes and sweat, and his eyes scanned me like he was inspecting some kind of object. He reached out and touched my cheek, and I jerked back instantly, pressing myself into the wall. His laugh got louder and he said, "Yeah, he'll do." Those words, "he'll do." I didn't understand what they meant at the time, but the way they both looked at each other told me it wasn't good. After that, the second man stood up and left, his footsteps fading down the hall. The tall man lingered, his eyes locked on me. For the first time I saw something shift in his face. It wasn't anger. It wasn't pity. It was something colder, like he was calculating. He leaned closer and whispered, "You do what I tell you or you won't survive this." Then he left too, locking the door behind him. That was the first time I truly understood I wasn't just trapped, I was owned. I wasn't a kid anymore. I was something they could pass around, something they could decide the fate of. From that night on, everything got worse. The food came less often. The silence was broken by arguments I couldn't understand through the walls, voices raised in anger, sometimes in laughter that chilled my blood. Every time I heard the footsteps, my heart felt like it was going to tear out of my chest. I started talking to myself just to hear a voice. I'd whisper my own name, my parents' names, anything to keep from forgetting them. I'd repeat, "My name is Michael, my mom's name is Ivana, my dad's name is Donald," over and over like a prayer. Because the biggest fear wasn't just that I'd never get out. It was that I'd forget who I was before I was taken. Then one day, without warning, they moved me. The move happened so suddenly I didn't even have time to process it. The door opened without the usual pause, and before I could react, the tall man was inside with a bag in his hand. He didn't speak, didn't explain. He just yanked me off the mattress by my arm so hard it felt like my shoulder might pop out of place. I remember stumbling, my legs weak from so many days without sunlight or space to walk. The hallway outside the room was narrow, dimly lit by a flickering bulb. The air smelled even worse out there, like mold mixed with gasoline. I tried to look around, but every time I slowed down he pulled me forward. When we reached the end of the hallway there was a set of stairs. He pushed me up them, and for the first time since I'd been taken, I felt the chill of outside air. It was night, and the sky above was darker than I remembered, no stars, just a heavy blanket of clouds. A van was parked nearby. Its paint was peeling, and one of the back doors was dented like it had been slammed too many times. He opened the door and shoved me inside. The smell hit me instantly, oil, old food, and something metallic I couldn't place at the time. The floor was covered with stained blankets and ropes that looked frayed from being tied too often. I curled into myself, but he strapped me down anyway, a belt across my chest and my wrists bound together. The ride felt endless. The engine roared, the tires hummed against the road, and I had no sense of direction. I tried to look through the cracks in the windows, but all I saw were flashes of trees, the occasional streetlight, and long stretches of nothing. The longer we drove, the more hopeless I felt. I kept thinking, my parents are out there somewhere. They must be looking for me. But how could they ever find me in all this darkness? At some point, exhaustion took over and I drifted in and out of sleep. Each time I opened my eyes, the world outside looked the same, empty, endless. I started to think maybe we weren't even on Earth anymore, like the van was some kind of machine taking me further and further from everything I knew. When the van finally stopped, my heart sank again. We weren't in a city. We weren't even near houses. We were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by thick woods. The trees loomed over us like silent guards, and the night air was so quiet that even the insects seemed afraid to make noise. He dragged me out of the van and led me toward a small building tucked between the trees. It wasn't a house, it looked more like an old cabin, one that had been abandoned long ago. The wood was rotting, the windows covered in grime, and the door creaked like it hadn't been opened in years. Inside it was worse. Dust filled the air so thick it made me cough. The floorboards groaned under every step. There were no lights, just a lantern on the table that cast long, shifting shadows on the walls. He tied me to a chair in the corner, tighter than before, and sat across from me. That was the first night he really spoke to me. Not commands, not threats. He started telling me rules. Things like, don't try to run. Don't make noise at night. Don't touch the windows. Don't ask questions. He listed them slowly, his voice low and steady, like he'd repeated them 100 times before. Then he leaned forward, his eyes locked on mine, and said, if you follow the rules, you'll live. If you don't, you won't. I didn't nod. I didn't speak. I just stared at him, too scared to even breathe too loudly. Deep down, I wanted to believe that if I listened, if I followed every rule, maybe I'd survive long enough for someone to find me. But another part of me, the part that still remembered my mom's voice, knew the truth. No one even knew where I was anymore. And that realization was almost worse than the fear. Life in that cabin was nothing like life in the first place he kept me. If the concrete room had been a prison, then this was something worse. It was like a twisted version of a home, a place meant to remind me what I'd lost. The rules weren't just words, they were everywhere. He enforced them with a kind of precision that made me realize he had done this before. I wasn't the first. That thought gnawed at me every time I looked at him. How many others had sat in this same chair, tied with the same rope, forced to follow the same rules? And what happened to them? Mornings were the hardest, if you could even call them that. The cabin had no clock, no way to track time, but I could tell when the faint light pushed its way through the cracks in the filthy curtains. He'd untie me just long enough to force food into my hands. Cold cereal, stale bread, sometimes nothing at all. I'd eat in silence while he sat at the table, staring, always staring. During the day he gave me tasks. At 6 years old, they were meaningless. Sweeping the floor with a broken broom, wiping dust off shelves that were already layered in grime, stacking old newspapers that reeked of mildew. If I slowed down, if I looked at him the wrong way, he'd slam his fist on the table so hard the dishes rattled. He never hit me, not then, but the sound alone was enough to make me cry without tears. At night, the cabin became unbearable. The woods outside were alive with sounds, branches snapping, owls screeching, the wind scraping against the walls, but he had made it clear, don't make noise at night. Don't touch the windows. I didn't know why, but I didn't dare disobey. I'd sit in the corner on that same mattress, pulling the blanket over my head, trying to make myself invisible. It was in those long, suffocating nights that my mind began to slip. I'd hear whispers I knew weren't real, my mom calling my name, my dad telling me it was going to be okay. Sometimes I swore I heard footsteps circling the cabin, softer and quicker than his. Shadows would stretch across the walls in shapes that didn't belong to either of us. Whether it was real or not, I never found out. I never dared to look. The tall man, my captor, rarely slept. I'd see him pacing sometimes, staring out the window like he was waiting for something. His eyes were always bloodshot, his face pale in the lantern light. And when he did look at me, it wasn't anger I saw. It was an obsession, like I was both his prisoner and his project. I learned quickly that survival meant silence. If I wanted to avoid punishment, I had to be invisible, obedient, and forget I even had a voice. But deep inside, I held on to one tiny shred of resistance. I repeated my parents' names under my breath, every single night until I fell asleep. It was the only thing keeping me from losing myself completely. But one night I slipped. I made noise when I wasn't supposed to. And that's when I finally learned what happens when you break his rules. It happened on what I think was my 12th or 13th night in that cabin. By then, the rules were carved into my brain like scars. But that night, something in me cracked. I had been whispering again my parents' names, my own name, just to remind myself I was real. But my whispers turned into a soft hum, a song I barely remembered from home. It was something my mom used to sing while cooking, just a simple melody. I didn't even realize how loud I was getting until the floorboards creaked. I froze. The lantern in the other room flickered, and I heard his footsteps. Slow. Heavy. Closer. My heart was pounding so hard I thought he could hear it. The door to my little corner swung open, and there he was, filling the frame like a shadow. His eyes locked on me, not wide, not furious, just cold. The kind of cold that doesn't need shouting to terrify you. He stepped inside, shut the door behind him, and stood there for what felt like forever. Then he crouched down, grabbed me by the wrist, and pulled me out into the main room. His grip was like iron. I didn't even struggle, I knew it wouldn't help. He sat me down in the chair at the table and tied me tighter than he ever had before. The rope bit into my skin, cutting off circulation until my hands tingled. He didn't speak for a long time. He just sat across from me staring, letting the silence stretch so thin it hurt. Finally he leaned forward and said, "I told you. No noise at night." His voice was so calm it was worse than yelling. Then he reached under the table and pulled something out. A small old tape recorder. He set it down between us, pressed play, and what came out made my stomach drop. It was me. My voice. The whispers. The hum. Every sound I'd made that night. He had been recording me. I don't know what scared me more, the fact that he'd been listening in silence or that he'd taken the effort to keep proof of it. He leaned back, arms crossed, and played it again and again until the sound of my own voice made me want to scream. Then, without warning, he snapped the recorder shut, slammed it on the table, and leaned so close I could feel his breath on my face. "If you make another sound at night," he whispered, "I'll make sure you never speak again." He pulled out a knife. The blade caught the lantern light, flashing silver. He pressed it against my throat, not cutting but enough to feel the sharpness. My whole body went stiff. I wanted to cry, to beg, but my voice was gone. He stayed like that for several seconds, then slowly pulled the knife away and set it on the table, as if to remind me it was always there. That night I didn't whisper my parents' names. I didn't hum. I didn't even breathe too loudly. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my body trembling so violently I thought the mattress would shake apart. And from that night forward, the silence wasn't just fear, it was survival. My voice had been taken from me, replaced by the endless replay of his threat. But as much as I wanted to disappear, I knew deep down I couldn't survive like that forever. I needed something. Anything. A sign that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't completely lost in that nightmare. And then weeks later I found one. I don't know how long I had been in that cabin by then, days, weeks, maybe even months. Time didn't exist there. It was just fear, silence, and survival. But one morning when he let me out of the chair to do my tasks, something happened that changed everything. I was sweeping near the corner of the main room, dragging that broken broom across the warped floorboards, when the bristles caught on something. It wasn't dust or dirt, it was the edge of a board that had warped just enough to stick up. He was sitting at the table, watching me like always, but his eyes were half closed, like he hadn't slept in days. That was the only reason I dared to nudge the broom again, prying at that corner as quietly as I could. And there was a mark. A scratch in the wood. Not random, not natural. A word carved deep into the floor. It said, "Help." My heart skipped. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, I felt something stir inside me that wasn't fear. Someone else had been here. Someone else had sat in this same cabin, under the same watch, and they had left this behind. I dropped the broom quickly and covered the mark with my foot before he could notice. My hands shook so badly I had to clench them together to hide it. The word burned in my mind like fire. Help. It wasn't much, but it was proof. Proof that I wasn't the first, proof that someone else had fought, proof that maybe I could too. That night, lying awake in the dark, I thought about the person who carved it. Were they still alive? Did they get out? Or were they gone, their only legacy a single desperate word scratched into the floor? I didn't know. But it didn't matter. The fact that it existed meant I wasn't completely alone. From that moment on, I started paying closer attention. I studied the cabin whenever I could, where the windows stuck, which floorboards creaked the loudest, and how long he stayed outside when he fetched water from the pump in the woods. I memorized the knots he used to tie me down, the way he locked the door, even the rhythm of his footsteps when he paced. I wasn't strong enough to fight him. I wasn't fast enough to outrun him. But maybe, just maybe, I could outlast him. It was a dangerous thought, and part of me hated myself for even letting it in. Because with every spark of hope came the crushing weight of what could happen if he caught me trying. The knife on the table, the way his voice went cold when he whispered threats, it was all still fresh in my mind. But that single word on the floor wouldn't leave me alone. It followed me into my dreams, whispered to me in the silence, urging me to keep watching, keep waiting. Because maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of this hell. And then came the day when I got my first real chance. The chance came on a day that started like all the others. He had given me a stale piece of bread, a tin cup of water, and set me to sweeping again while he sat by the window, smoking one of his hand-rolled cigarettes. I remember the smell filling the cabin, thick and bitter, while the smoke curled upward in slow spirals. He looked tired, more tired than I had ever seen him. His head kept dipping, his shoulders sagging like he hadn't slept in days. That was when I saw the key. It was lying on the table beside him, the same table where he'd once pressed the knife to my throat. Just a dull metal key, scratched and worn, but to me it glowed like treasure. I knew it had to be for the front door. My heart started hammering so hard I thought he'd hear it. I kept sweeping, inching closer to the table with each stroke of the broom, acting like I was just following the dust. He lit another cigarette, his eyelids drooping, his body sinking into the chair. And then just for a moment he closed his eyes. That was it. That was my chance. I dropped the broom and lunged. My small fingers wrapped around the key, cold and heavy in my hand. I didn't even stop to think. I ran straight for the door, my bare feet slapping against the floorboards. The lock jammed at first, my hands shaking too badly to fit the key in. I could hear him stir behind me, his chair scraping against the floor, his voice low and sharp. "What do you think you're doing?" The key finally turned. The door clicked open. For the first time since I'd been taken, I felt real air rush across my face, the crisp scent of trees, damp soil, the wild night waiting just beyond. Freedom was right there, one step away. And then he grabbed me. His hand clamped down on the back of my neck, squeezing so hard I thought my bones would snap. He yanked me back inside, slamming the door shut with his other hand. The key slipped from my fingers and clattered to the floor. Before I could even scream, he threw me down so hard my knees split against the wood. I remember the rage in his face, different from the cold control he usually showed. This was raw, animal fury. He snatched the knife from the table and held it up, his hand trembling. "Do you want to die here?" he hissed. "Because I can make that happen." I shook my head violently, tears streaming down my face. I couldn't breathe, couldn't speak. My body shook so hard I thought I'd pass out. He didn't cut me. But he dragged the blade across the table, gouging deep scars into the wood, the sound of metal scraping on wood piercing my ears. Then he slammed the knife down, the point sticking upright just inches from my hand. "That was your one chance," he said. "Try again and I won't stop myself." That night he didn't tie me to the chair. He tied me to the bed frame instead, so tight my arms went numb. I lay there in the dark, the rope burning my skin, my body aching. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the door opening, felt the cold air of freedom, only to be pulled back into the nightmare. The word on the floor help still burned in my mind. But now it felt more like a curse than hope. Because the truth hit me harder than ever. I wasn't the first to try. And maybe none of us ever made it out alive. After the escape attempt, everything changed. He wasn't calm anymore. He wasn't predictable. It was like I had broken something inside him. The punishments weren't just about silence or obedience, now they were about control. He stopped giving me regular meals, sometimes withholding food for an entire day just to watch me suffer. When he did feed me, it was scraps, half-rotten fruit, stale crusts of bread, things even an animal would hesitate to eat. I ate them anyway. Hunger has a way of killing your pride. The worst part wasn't the food though. It was how he watched me. Before, he'd always stared like I was an object, something he owned. But now, his eyes had this twitch, this restless movement, like he was waiting for me to try again. Like he wanted me to fail. Nights grew unbearable. He started pacing more, muttering to himself. Sometimes I'd wake up to find him standing over me, the lantern in his hand, his face lit from below so his eyes looked hollow. He wouldn't say anything. He'd just stand there until I shook so badly that the rope squeaked against the bed frame. Then he'd finally walk away, leaving me drenched in cold sweat. At some point I stopped keeping track of days. The silence in the cabin wasn't just outside anymore, it was inside me too. My voice, my name, my memories of home, they were slipping away. I caught myself forgetting my mom's face, the exact sound of my dad's laugh. Every time I realized that, I'd dig my nails into my skin until it hurt, just to remind myself I was still there. But then came the breaking point. It was raining hard one night, the kind of rain that pounds on the roof like 1,000 fists. I was tied up as always, the lantern throwing sickly shadows across the room. He was sitting at the table, the knife beside him, his head buried in his hands. For the first time since I'd been taken, I heard him cry. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even steady. Just these broken sounds like the sobs were being forced out of him. At first I thought I was imagining it. But when he lifted his head, his face was wet, his eyes red. And then he said something I'll never forget. "They never wanted me. No one ever wanted me." His voice cracked on those words, and for a moment, I saw him not as the monster who had taken my life, but as something else, a broken man, twisted by his own pain. It didn't make him less terrifying. If anything, it made him more dangerous. Because now I realized he wasn't just holding me here out of cruelty. He was holding me here out of need. I was his replacement for whatever love, whatever family he had lost or never had. And that made me realize something even worse. He would never let me go. Not alive. That night, as the rain hammered the roof and he muttered to himself in the dark, I understood one brutal truth. If I wanted to see my parents again, I couldn't just wait for a chance. I couldn't just hope someone would find me. I would have to risk everything. Even if it meant dying trying. the decision to escape again wasn't sudden. It was something that built inside me piece by piece until I couldn't hold it anymore. I had been 6 when he stole me from my parents. I had grown inside that cabin, forced into silence, taught to obey. But somewhere deep inside, a voice still whispered my name. A voice still told me I belonged to someone else. The storm that night became my cover. He had drunk more than usual, empty bottles scattered across the table, the knife pushed aside. His muttering turned to slurred nonsense, then to snores that rattled through the cabin. My heart pounded so hard it hurt, but I told myself, this is it. This is the moment. The rope around my wrist had loosened over time from me pulling at it every chance I got. My skin was raw and scarred from trying, but that night, with the thunder masking the squeak of the fibers, I tugged harder than ever. My wrist slid free and for a second I froze. I couldn't believe it had actually worked. I wanted to run, but I knew I couldn't just burst through the door. He was a light sleeper. Instead, I crept step by step toward the door. Every crack of thunder covered the creak of the floorboards, but every pause between storms made me want to vomit from fear. When I reached the latch, my hands shook so badly I almost dropped it. I pulled it up, slowly, silently, until the door cracked open and the cold, wet air of the storm rushed inside. For the first time in years, real air, fresh air, hit my face. I almost cried right there. But then the floor creaked behind me. He was awake. "Where are you going?" His voice was hoarse, half asleep, but full of danger. I didn't think. I ran. I threw the door open and bolted into the rain. My bare feet slapped against mud and stones, cutting me open, but I didn't care. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but I kept running. Behind me, I heard his roar, this guttural, inhuman sound, and then the slam of the door as he came after me. The forest was alive with shadows, trees bending in the storm, branches whipping my face. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't even know which way was safe. All I knew was forward. Keep moving. Don't stop. And then headlights. Through the blur of rain and darkness, I saw the faint glow of a road ahead. My heart almost exploded. I stumbled onto the gravel, waving my arms, screaming, my voice breaking into pieces. A truck screeched to a halt just a few feet from me, its horn blaring. The driver jumped out, yelling something, but I couldn't even answer. I just collapsed into the mud. The last thing I remember before everything went black was seeing him, the man who had stolen me, standing at the edge of the trees, frozen, watching. He didn't come any closer. He just stood there, the rain soaking him, his face unreadable. Then he turned and disappeared back into the darkness. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed. Bright lights. Clean sheets. My body felt heavy, but my chest felt lighter than it ever had. There were police officers around me, doctors asking questions. But then the door opened. And there they were. My mom and dad. Older, thinner, faces lined with years of pain, but still them. The second I saw them, all the walls I had built to survive broke apart. I screamed, cried, tried to get out of bed, and when they rushed to me, I felt their arms wrap around me for the first time in what felt like forever. I buried my face in my mom's shoulder, smelling the faint trace of the perfume she used to wear, and I didn't let go. My dad kept kissing the top of my head, whispering, "You're safe now. You're safe now." And for the first time in years, I actually believed it. But even now, even as I sit here telling this story, a part of me still feels the echo of those years. The silence of the cabin. The sound of his footsteps in the dark. The way he cried that night like a broken child himself. I reunited with my parents. I got my life back. But some nights, when the house is too quiet, I swear I can still hear him whispering. And that's when I realize, I may have escaped him, but I'll never truly leave him behind. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and turn on your notifications.